And today is Friday, September the 18th, the year 2020. This is the Brian on Baseball podcast. I'm Brian Goudsward as we come to you on a day that's starting to feel like fall here in the Northeast. Temperatures are in the 60s. We've had a few days like that of late. And the more the weather patterns change here in the later part of September, the more you realize that the baseball postseason is right around the corner. And amazingly, we are down to the final 10 games or so of this abbreviated regular season, and it's at that point, once we finish those 10 games, that all the fun will begin in what is sure to be a wild ride in October with 16 teams making the playoffs. That's good news in particular for one of the locals. The other, it's a little bit more of an iffy situation. We'll get to the Mets, the latter of the two that I was just discussing, in a little bit, but I got to start with the Yankees. And I think as I started this podcast today, they just hit another ball over the fence at Yankee Stadium, because my goodness, what a power display we saw from this team in a 3-game demolishing at the hands of the Toronto Blue Jays. The run totals for the Yankees in the 3 games, 20, 13, and 10. Breaking history, becoming the first team ever to homer 6 times in 3 consecutive games. Just unbelievable what they were able to do, and what a difference a week makes, because a week ago I did the show and you really didn't know exactly where the Yankees stood. They had finally taken one game, the last game of that previous series against the Blue Jays, that had been on the road. Well, then what did they do? They demolished the Baltimore Orioles. I talked last week about the need to put some separation between themselves and the Orioles, a team that frankly they shouldn't be that close with in the standings, but the Orioles had kind of pecked their way and were making some noise. Well, that was the end of that after last weekend's 4-game sweep, and they've just continued right along here with the Toronto series, just burying them. I mean, it was everybody getting into the act, from the usual suspects like DJ LeMahieu and Giancarlo Stanton, now that he's healthy, to the unusual and the most unusual in Kyle Higashioka, of all people, the backup catcher who homered 3 times 2 nights ago. So everyone getting in on the act. This team is getting healthier now. I mentioned they got Stanton back in the lineup. Judge is back too. He sat yesterday in the 10-run uprising, but at least, you know, he's back in the lineup now. So they're about now where you would expect, having passed the Blue Jays in the standings and certainly headed for the playoffs, which was never really in great peril, just because the other teams that were behind them, nobody really took seriously. The Orioles and the Seattle Mariners and the Tigers, those kind of teams, there was no way they were going to keep up good enough play where they could sneak into the playoffs. They're just not good enough. And so order has kind of been restored here in the last week or so, with the Yankees just eviscerating the baseball and making mincemeat of the Blue Jays' rotation in this 3-game series. I mean, one inning alone, they hit, 4 or 5 home runs, 3 in a row. So, like I said, it's just everybody getting in on the act. And look no further than Luke Voit, who now has a major league leading 20 home runs. He's been a savior for this team and has put himself as one of the MVP candidates in the American League, along with teammate DJ LeMahieu. In a year like last year, where so many other key guys had been out of action, those two had been the stalwarts. LeMahieu did have a stint on the injured list as well, but those two atop the order have made this team go, and you just wonder where they would be without them, because they were going really poorly for a while, but Voit always kept them to where they didn't completely fall apart, and now he's just taken it to a new level this season. What a trade that was. Kind of undervalued at the time they got him from the St. Louis Cardinals. You didn't exactly know who was going to be the first baseman. He had burst on the scene when he first got here, but the Yankees had always preferred Greg Bird in that position. We know that just didn't work out with injuries and otherwise, and Voit has now taken a stranglehold on that position and run with it, and now culminating in an MVP-like season this year. So all is right in Yankee world, and even Gary Sanchez has picked the batting average up to about 145, so he hit a home run as part of the trouncing in this series, so maybe he's starting to come around, and if that happens, this lineup looks really potent. So the Yankees are in a good spot right now. I was never overly concerned just because of the rest of the competition in the American League didn't seem like they could make enough noise. And now the Yankees get ready for October, and this hot streak has come at the right time because it's now getting toward the end of the year. They're getting key guys back, and now they're ready to go toe-to-toe. Maybe it'll be the Tampa Bay Rays. Won't that be interesting should they meet in the playoffs, considering all the troubles they've had beating the Rays this season? But maybe the Yankees get a measure of their revenge when it matters most in the playoffs. We shall see. But boy, you had to like watching them this week and watching the unbelievable power display, the likes of which we have not seen before in the history of the game. So now they will turn their attention this weekend to the Boston Red Sox, and this is a team that they have handled, to say the least, this year. Now they go to Fenway. I think it's the first time they go up to Boston this year. The Red Sox, after an atrocious start where everything seemingly went wrong early in the year, we knew their pitching was going to be suspect early on. This lineup just was not hitting at all. And look, it hasn't been a good season whatsoever, but they at least have kind of stabilized things to where they're playing, 500 baseball over the last few weeks or so and not looking like one of the worst teams in the league. And there have been a few reasons for that, but I think the biggest has been, look, there was a lot of negative attention given on the Mookie Betts trade, and rightfully so. When you trade a franchise icon like Betts, a guy who was as popular with that fan base, a guy who was so good both on and off the field for that organization, that was going to be seen as a majorly unpopular move. But one thing that has happened is they've gotten Alex Verdugo, and he's having a really nice offensive season. He's a guy that just they didn't have room for with the Dodgers because of all the guys they have in that outfield, the depth of that organization. He never really got a chance to prosper. Well, now he is playing every day in right field, and he's had a very good season, hitting well over 300, hitting atop that order, and been instrumental to their improved offense of late. And then you throw in that a couple guys you knew were going to have good seasons based on what they did a year ago, and that's Xander Bogaerts, Rafael Devers. Both of them, especially Devers, pretty shaky early on. They picked it up in a big way. Now, it has been a completely lost year for J.D. Martinez. I know that him and a couple other players around the game have blamed it on the inability to watch in-game video based on the COVID-19 protocols. Whether there's something to that, I don't know, but J.D. Martinez is not doing nearly what he did the first 2 years when he was a monster in that Red Sox uniform. The pitching staff is still pretty dreadful. I mean, we have to call it like we see it. It's a lot of openers. It's just been a lot of ineffective pitching, both starting and relieving. So the thing that's picked up with the Red Sox is the offense, not necessarily the pitching, and it's been obviously a very difficult year, but they have at least managed to play a little bit better baseball, a little more respectable baseball lately, and so maybe they'll put a representative team out there this weekend, and it won't be so easy for the Yankees to just bury them like it was early on in the season. But we know the Yankees are hitting Fenway Park with red-hot bats, and that matched up with a suspect, to say the least, Red Sox pitching staff. We'll see what that brings starting this evening in Boston. And then we get to the Mets, where there's never any shortage of interesting things happening on the other side of town in Queens. This week the site was Philadelphia, where the Mets dropped the opener of the series and then managed to come back and take the next two to win the series and put themselves, incredibly enough, only a game and a half behind the final playoff spot in the National League. Yes, they're still under 500. They're 23-27, but in 2020 and possibly beyond, we'll have to see what the postseason picture looks like in the years to come. But at least for this year, it's good enough to be in the mix for the playoffs, and you have to give the Mets credit. You look at last night's game, it was a wild game, a seesaw affair. The Mets broke out to an early lead, and then Seth Lugo, who's a very good pitcher, but boy, last night, it was just serving up batting practice to the Phillies. He's given a lead, and the Phillies come out bottom of the first inning and bang out back-to-back home runs. Just like that, the game is tied. Phillies end up taking the lead. It looks like they're going to have the game, but then the Phillies bullpen strikes. And, I mean, just day after day with that Phillies bullpen, Joe Girardi's got to be pulling his hair out with what has gone on with that team, because they should be so much better. They've had leads in something like 70 or 80% of their games this year, but their record is now under 500 because of the bullpen's inability to get big outs and blowing so many games late. And last night was no exception, as the Mets were able to scratch and claw their way, wound up tying the game, and then in the ninth inning, put up a 4-spot capped off by a Robinson Cano home run, and then Edwin Diaz shuts the door in the ninth to make the Mets a 10-6 winner. And one thing I got to get to with the Mets is all of a sudden, you look at the Robinson Cano and Edwin Diaz trade, and look, I'm not going to praise this trade by any stretch of the imagination, because any fan knows it was a sketchy deal to begin with, and last year things did not go well at all for either of them. But you look at their performances this season, and they've been pretty good. Robinson Cano has had a big bounce-back year. He's had big hits for this team. He's hitting well over 300. And Edwin Diaz, who was just a nightmare last season, and this year didn't exactly get off to a sparkling start. You look at his numbers, he's pitching pretty darn well now. ERA is under 2. He's appeared now in the last 3 games. He's had big saves. You knew the stuff was always there with this guy. It was there last year. He was still striking out plenty of hitters. The problem was the ball was leaving the yard left and right. While this year, after a shaky start, he blew some games early on. He was serving up the long ball, but lately that has not been happening, and he's got electric stuff. He's striking out something like 50% of hitters that he faces this season, so it has been a big bounce back. Now, in the long haul, was this trade going to be seen as a good one for the organization? Probably not, because we know how high regarded a prospect Jarred Kelenic is, and even though he's yet to see major league action, he's expected to be a fixture in that Seattle lineup for years to come, while Robinson Cano, let's face it, is an aging player, and Diaz, we didn't know if he had what it took to handle New York. But my point is, as things stand right now, both of those guys are performing well, and that's what you have to like if you're a Met fan right now. And I talked all season that you have to love what this lineup has done. They have gotten contributions up and down, none bigger than Dom Smith. Good for Dom Smith, who last year pretty much fell out of a job. You know, he looked like he was going to be the first baseman before Pete Alonso burst onto the scene with a 53 home run rookie season. Well, now Dom Smith is playing the majority of the first base. Now, that doesn't mean Alonso's without a job. He's been the primary designated hitter, but there's been no comparison this year between the two players and what they've been able to do offensively. Dom Smith has been one of the better players in the game with an OPS over 1,000, up among the league leaders in RBIs. He has just been great for this team, playing every day, and we know all the difficulties he's faced off the field and speaking out about racism, which good for him that he's putting together this kind of season when circumstances in his personal life and off the field and everything going on in the world are against him. It's really just good to see what he's been able to do. So the Mets now will try to keep it going. They come home this weekend and meet the first place Atlanta Braves. Now the Braves come in scorching hot with the bats. I mean, Freddie Freeman might never be hotter than he is right now, hitting about 350 on the season. This might be the year where he gets that elusive National League MVP, as he has just been on a tear. And you think about how his season started kind of slow, because before the year began, he had a pretty significant case of the coronavirus. And so for him to come back with a vengeance like this just speaks to how good of a player he is. And one point I want to make is during the offseason, you know, they make these lists with the top 10 players at each position. And I remember talking about, they had Pete Alonso as the number 1 first baseman ahead of Freddie Freeman, which at the time I thought was ridiculous. Because here's the thing, Alonso did it for 1 season. Now we're seeing what he's doing in his second year. And look, he might still go on to have a great career. I hope he does. And maybe this is just a sophomore slump for him. But you cannot put Alonso ahead of Freddie Freeman, who has put up excellent production for a decade. That's what makes a great player, is doing it year in and year out, and that's exactly what he's done. So that was just a complete overreaction to put Alonso ahead of a guy who's one of the best players in the game, and like I said, may never be better than he is right now. And he's getting a lot of help in that lineup because, you know, the Braves seem to have perfected this 1-year deal before a guy hits free agency. Last year it was Josh Donaldson, had a very good year for them, went on to get a more lucrative deal with the Minnesota Twins. And this past offseason, it has been Marcell Ozuna, and what a year he is having, just tearing it up. Those top three guys in the lineup for the Braves, they've been hitting Acuna, Freeman, and Ozuna. As of just a couple days ago, all three of them had OPSs north of 1,000. And we saw what they were able to do in a 29-run outpouring against the Marlins. Their lineup has just been clicking, and they've needed it with the suspect starting rotation that they've had. But back to Ozuna, who in his Cardinal days just didn't seem like he was 100% healthy. And now he's looking more like the guy that he was in Miami. Kind of a streaky player, but boy, has he made a difference in the middle of that lineup for the Braves, being a monster run producer. And he, with Freeman, both among the league leaders in runs batted in this year. And then the other guy I want to get to with the Braves is Dansby Swanson, because this is a former number 1 overall draft pick. The expectations were sky high. And, you know, when you get drafted that high, people think you're going to be Francisco Lindor, Carlos Correa, the elites in the game, put up monster numbers, be a franchise player. That's not necessarily the case with Dansby Swanson, and you know what? That's not a problem at all, because this guy's become a really good player, and he's having a good offensive season, and you know he's going to make the plays defensively at shortstop. He's a winning kind of player. He's a guy who's going to be around for 10-plus years in the major leagues, and he's caught a lot of flack early on in his career for not necessarily being an offensive difference maker. Well, that's starting to develop, and like I said, he's good both sides of the ball. You know what you're going to get from him. He's sort of come into his own this year, and I just think he's a really good player that not a lot of people give enough credit to. So this Brave lineup, top to bottom. Oh, and then I got to get to Travis d'Arnaud. Oh, do I have to get to Travis d'Arnaud, who did we see just disappoint year after year. The high expectations after getting him from Toronto in the R.A. Dickey trade, and it just never worked out with the Mets. But like so many that we see leave the Mets, find greener pastures, and d'Arnaud has been no exception. I mean, he's another difference maker in that lineup, having a career season offensively. So look, this Brave team can mash, and they've gotten it from a variety of sources. And now we see d'Arnaud facing his old team. We already saw him have a big hit against them early on in the year. You know, the Mets typically have trouble with the Braves, but they got to get every win they possibly can down the stretch here, because time is running out. Yes, there is still the chance that they sneak their way into the playoffs. Don't ask me how, with a starting rotation that has been hard to watch this season and didn't get very good news this week when Jacob deGrom lasted only 2 innings and then left with a hamstring spasm, something I haven't really heard too much when it comes to injuries. But with the Mets, you know, they can invent injuries, it seems. So hopefully deGrom will be good enough to make his next start, and a big series coming up against the division rival Braves should be fun at Citi Field beginning tonight. I'll get to the rest of the schedule coming up, but now we move into our segment where we highlight one series to watch for the weekend slate. And again, it's a Friday where you have so many games because there's so many doubleheaders to catch up on missed games earlier on in the season. And so I think it's something like 18 games on the slate tonight with 3 more doubleheaders. But the series I'm going to watch is going to be in Cincinnati, and that's where we find the Chicago White Sox, who will be taking on the Reds. Now, the White Sox are one of 3 teams that has already punched their ticket to the playoffs. They, along with the Tampa Bay Rays, did so yesterday, and of course the first was the Los Angeles Dodgers. So we'll see how the White Sox fare this weekend. I'm more interested from a Cincinnati perspective because this is a team that's now gotten hot. They've won their last 5 games. They have put themselves in a playoff position as of now, knocking out the Cardinals. So it'll be very interesting to see who that last spot comes down to. Mention the Mets still in the mix. Rockies pretty much look like they've fallen out of it. So it looks like it's going to be those teams. Maybe the Brewers have one last gasp in them, a team that seems to have magical Septembers here recently. But the Reds are going to be dangerous because of that starting rotation. And should they get into the playoffs, and can throw Trevor Bauer and Luis Castillo and Sonny Gray at you, that's going to be tough for an opposing team. And it's a lineup that really hasn't been anything to write home about this year. Their big free agent acquisitions have had substandard offensive years, both Castellanos and Mike Moustakas. At this point, I've kind of given up hope that Joey Votto can turn back the clock and look like the MVP Joey Votto of old. But the Reds, nonetheless, because of that rotation, are going to be dangerous, and this series should be fun to watch with all of the talent that the Chicago White Sox have. Now, maybe something of a hangover that happens sometimes after the playoffs are clinched, but wow, has this team been fun to watch and just mashing the baseball this season. I mean, Jose Abreu looks like an MVP candidate. He's been a monster run producer. Tim Anderson hitting atop that order. He's hitting in the 380 range. What a player he's become. The trades that they made to get core foundational pieces, Yoan Moncada and Eloy Jimenez, have just worked out brilliantly for this team. And so they set the foundation in place, and in this past offseason, they sprinkled in the free agent acquisitions with Yasmani Grandal, Dallas Keuchel, Edwin Encarnacion, and they just have the makings of a team that is built to last. And they're going to be scary come playoff time. The one other guy I want to get to with the White Sox is Yasmani Grandal gets the headlines for signing that big deal to be the everyday catcher, but James McCann is putting together a heck of a season. A guy who's in his walk year, he'll be a free agent at season's end and is poised to get paid because he's having a big-time year, making an impact and just adding to all of the offensive sources that this team has at its disposal. Pitching-wise, they got a legitimate front of the rotation starter in Giolito. Keuchel, knows his way around pitching. So the White Sox are the number one seed in the American League, best record in the league, and are going to be a tough out in the playoffs to be sure. And we'll be watching them this weekend in Cincinnati as the Reds try to see if they can keep this run going. They've gotten the benefit of playing a pretty lackluster schedule, the Pirates, this week, but they've taken advantage, and now they'll try to keep it going against one of the elite teams starting tonight at home. And now for the rest of the schedule for this Friday, and I mentioned there are 3 doubleheaders, so a couple of them I'm not going to go through the pitching matchups because we have TBD determined for a few teams, which is always annoying. But nonetheless, we'll start here with the aforementioned Mets, who are welcoming in the Braves. It'll be Max Fried, who makes the start coming off the injured list, and he has had a tremendous year. He's 6-0 with a 1.98 ERA. Meanwhile, it'll be fellow left-hander Steven Matz, who's had a very difficult year. Remember, he got bumped from the rotation, wound up in the bullpen, then injured. So we'll see if he can kind of bounce back down the stretch of this regular season, and the Mets are going to need it because they just don't have much in the way in that starting staff. Cardinals and the Pirates are one of the aforementioned doubleheaders from Pittsburgh. First game at 4:05. Carlos Martinez is back in the rotation for the Redbirds. Trevor Williams draws the Game 1 assignment for Pittsburgh. And the nightcap tonight, where the Cardinals will be the home team at PNC Park. Chad Kuhl will be on the mound, and he'll be opposed by Daniel Ponce de Leon. Another doubleheader comes your way in Philadelphia, where the reeling Phillies welcome in the Blue Jays. And I say reeling because we know they just lost the series to the Mets. They're a game under 500, but the big problem for the Phillies, in addition to all their bullpen woes, is injuries and how they are piling up. JT Realmuto has been out of the lineup. He's expected to miss this weekend series. Rhys Hoskins was forced to the injured list. So the Phillies without a number of key players. Jake Arrieta as well got hurt in the series against the Mets. So if they're going to find their way into the playoffs, they're going to have to get some reinforcements and in a hurry. Big double dip today. Zach Eflin is on the mound against Robbie Ray, who recently came over in a trade from Arizona. Ross Stripling will go in the nightcap for Toronto. We don't know for the Phillies. Nationals and the Marlins, doubleheader from Miami. Indians and the Tigers from Detroit. Cleveland finally snapped their 8-game losing streak last night. What it takes to do that is having Shane Bieber on the mound. He delivered. Tonight it'll be Zach Plesac against Michael Fulmer. White Sox and the Reds, as I mentioned, the matchup tonight is Jonathan Stever against Tyler Mahle in the opener. Yankees and the Red Sox from Boston to start the series. It's a couple of left-handers there as well, Jordan Montgomery and Martin Perez. Rays and the Orioles, they split a doubleheader last night. Tonight's matchup at Camden Yards, Tyler Glasnow against Alex Cobb. Diamondbacks and the Astros meet in Houston, and it's a pair of Zachs on the mound. A couple of good ones at that. Zach Gallen against Zach Greinke. Dodgers and the Rockies from Colorado. Dodgers' big win yesterday. Ryan Castellani is on the bump for Colorado. Royals and the Brewers starting a series tonight in Milwaukee. It's Danny Duffy against Adrian Hauser. Twins and the Cubs from Wrigley Field. It'll be Rich Hill opposing Kyle Hendricks, matchup of a couple veterans there. American League West matchup is what we find at the Big A in Anaheim. Texas will be there, and it'll be Jimmy Herget opposing right-hander Jaime Barria. Padres and the Mariners, that series supposed to be in Seattle, but it will be in San Diego because of poor air quality in Seattle. Remember back when the primary reason games could be postponed was rain? Well, yeah, that was so 2019. This year we've seen a whole other bunch of reasons why games are moved and or canceled. And the matchup tonight in San Diego is Chris Paddock against Yusei Kikuchi. Padres trying to bounce back after a rare series defeat at the hands of the Dodgers. And finally to the Bay Area, where the site will be Oakland, and it'll be the Bay Area counterparts, Giants, with Logan Webb on the mound, matching up with Chris Bassett. Bassett has been one of the unsung bright spots as far as pitchers go this season, as he's sporting an ERA under 3 for Oakland. Terrible news for the A's last weekend when they found out that Matt Chapman was going to miss the rest of the season. That takes their best player out of that lineup, just a rock for that franchise. Going to be very difficult for the A's to make a substantial run in October without one of their best players. They did sign Jake Lamb. He kind of fallen out of favor with Arizona. Maybe he's able to replace some of the production, but that's a guy who's going to be very difficult to replace in Oakland. And the Giants continue to go right along here. Game over 500. They've beaten up on the Mariners this week, and the story has been the offense, which has come from some unexpected sources. I've talked about Mike Yastrzemski, but the one guy I want to highlight for the Giants who is just having a tremendous season is Brandon Belt. And, you know, sometimes you get guys to just have these red-hot years out of nowhere, and it goes a long way in what you do in a season. That's exactly what's happened with the Giants. You don't expect this kind of season from Belt or Brandon Crawford or even Mike Yastrzemski, but it's all kind of worked together, and the Giants just may find their way in the postseason. And now we move into this day in baseball history, and it was on this day, September the 18th, back in 1968, Cardinals pitcher Ray Washburn no-hit the Giants at Candlestick Park 2-0. The pitching gem came the day after Gaylord Perry of the Giants had no-hit St. Louis 1-0. These games mark the only time that no-hitters have been thrown on successive days in the same ballpark. And one other note regarding no-hitters, it may have gotten lost in the shuffle over the weekend on Sunday when the Chicago Cubs' Alec Mills, of all pitchers, no-hit the Brewers in a trouncing win for the Cubs. So that, like I said, probably got lost in the shuffle, and a fairly anonymous guy throwing a no-hitter, but nonetheless, Alec Mills joining Lucas Giolito as the 2020 no-hitters. And we end today, as we always do, with the ninth inning, where today's note comes courtesy of Albert Pujols, because this may have been another thing that kind of got lost in all the events of last weekend. But maybe you did notice that Albert Pujols hit a home run against the Colorado Rockies, tying Willie Mays for the 5th most home runs all-time, 660 in the great career of Albert Pujols. I bring this up because I feel like Albert Pujols has had 2 careers all in one, and the one that we remember is, of course, the St. Louis Cardinals, where he made his Hall of Fame mark. And, you know, the first 10 seasons of his career, it was a guarantee, 300-plus batting average, 30 homers, 100 RBIs. Signed the huge deal with the Angels. He's on the back 9 of his career. He's been a mediocre player for a long time now, that I think we almost forget the brilliance of Albert Pujols. And does that not show it, tying Willie Mays' 660 career home runs? An all-time great Pujols is, and an obvious first-ballot Hall of Famer when his name comes up on the ballot. And so that will do it for this edition of the Brian on Baseball podcast. Thank you for listening today, And one other note here, I want to mention that there's another podcast, as you can catch me with Pete Vaccaro talking football on a First and 10 podcast that we'll record. Last week we did it on Saturday. This week, possibly on Tuesday, where we break down the week of football and preview the next week of matchups. So if you're into that sort of thing, you can catch me doing that. Thank you again for listening today, and our thanks as always go to Dylan DePrado. Enjoy your weekend at baseball. Stretch run here of the regular season, final 10 games or so. Should be fun. We'll be back for another one next week. I'm Brian Gadzard saying so long from Middletown, New Jersey.